Final project.
Choose an English American literary piece as your main topic or springboard in the discussion of your lesson. Prepare a semi detailed lesson plan following the format you have learned in your prop-ed subject. You should be able to criticize the literary piece you chose using any of the literary critic movement we discussed. After creating your lesson plan, deliver it in a formal video lesson of not more than 40 minutes. So, Beowulf is the topic for our lesson. So, objectives. First, appreciate the narrative poem about the battle with Grendel. Next is share some prior knowledge about the topic and see compare Beowulf and Grendel. And lastly, critique the literary piece Beowulf. So before we proceed to the lesson proper, let me give you first the motivation. So this motivation was entitled Hit the Hints. So I'm gonna show you some pictures that is related to our topic, and I want you to guess what is the title of the movie and who's the characters in that movie. So the pictures will be on the next slide. Study the following photos. Do you know the characters in the photos? In your paper, list down the character you know in each photos. So after giving the names of the movies and the characters in each photos, please answer these guide questions. Number 1. Who among the characters do you like the most? Why? Number 2. Do you want to be like them? Explain. And lastly, based on their characteristics and intentions, what name could be associated with them? So that's all for our motivation. Now let's proceed to the discussion proper. Beowulf is an Old English epic story consisting of 3,182 alternative lines. It may be the oldest surviving long story in Old English and is commonly cited as one of the most important works of Old English literature. The author was an anonymous Anglo-Saxon poet referred by the scholars as the Beowulf. Read the epic poem Beowulf, which deals with the war and adventure. It is said to be the greatest poem ever written in modern European language 4 centuries before the Norman conquest. Beowulf shows an interplay of Christian and pagan beliefs. The original writer remains unknown. It has been said that Burton Raphael's translation from the original Old English is the most celebrated and most read by the students and the general readers alike. So I put a copy of the poem The Battle with Grendel, translated by Burton Raphael. And if you want for a clearer version, please go to the link that I put on the next slide for clearer version. So here's the link. I hope you enjoy reading the poem.
After reading the poem for a better experience, I will let you watch the movie of Beowulf. After that, prepare for some activities.
Summary of Beowulf. Beowulf is the epic adventure story of a heroic young prince who saves a neighboring kingdom by destroying both a troll-like monster and the monster's avenging mother. Later in life, King Beowulf must face a dragon and his own mortality when his own kingdom is threatened. The story is actually a 3,000-line poem composed in Old English in the 8th century and was the first English-language story to be written down. The author is unknown and is simply called the Beowulf Poet. The story takes place in the early to mid-6th century and consists of 2 parts. The first begins with young Prince Beowulf of the Geats. Geatland is the same as the modern-day island of Gotland, which lies in the Baltic Sea just east of Sweden. To the south in Denmark, King Hrothgar of the Danes is being terrorized by a ravaging, troll-like monster called Grendel. Grendel hates the sounds of happiness and celebrating, so every night he comes to King Hrothgar's magnificent feasting hall to kill and eat the king's warriors. This has been going on for 12 years when Prince Beowulf arrives unannounced with a small band of men. He says he has heard of the trouble and wants to try his hand at destroying the monster. King Hrothgar agrees to let Beowulf try, even though no sword can cut through Grendel's skin. The king offers food and drink and then leaves the hall with Beowulf and the men of Geatland closed up inside. That night, in order to lure Grendel, Beowulf and his men celebrate loudly and boisterously. It works, and Grendel comes to attack them. He kills one of Beowulf's men, but this time he has met his match, for Beowulf, making no attempt to use a sword, battles Grendel hand to hand and succeeds in tearing off the monster's arm at the shoulder. Grendel then flees the feasting hall and goes out into the wilderness, where he dies. All of the warriors celebrate together, but the threat is by no means over. The next night, Grendel's mother, who has no name in the poem and is not clearly described as either human or monster, comes to the feasting hall to take her revenge. She kills one of Hrothgar's best fighters and leaves. But Beowulf follows her to her lair, which is in a cavern at the bottom of a lake. As before, with Grendel, a fierce battle takes place that is largely hand-to-hand. Eventually, as the fight continues, Beowulf sees a great sword on the cavern wall and is able to use it to behead Grendel's mother. Also in the cavern is the body of Grendel. Beowulf beheads it as well, though the blood from the monster dissolves the greatsword and leaves only the hilt. After getting back to the feasting hall, Beowulf is richly rewarded by King Hrothgar with both gifts and honors. Prince Beowulf then returns in triumph to his home and the family on the island of Geatland. The second part of the story opens some 50 years later, where the aged Beowulf is now the king of Geatland. It seems that a golden cup has been stolen from a dragon, enraging the beast so that it burns the countryside looking for its treasure. Beowulf sets out to fight the dragon, and even though his warriors go with him, he says he will face the creature alone. The battle is a terrible one, and Beowulf is beginning to lose. His men flee to the forest, feeling that they can do nothing against such an enemy. Yet one man does find the courage to remain with King Beowulf, and together they kill the dragon. Beowulf, however, has sustained a mortal wound and dies soon after the battle. The king is given a hero's funeral with his body burned on a pyre. His people then build a great mound near the edge of the sea in Beowulf's memory. The first part of the poem is that of a young prince on the way up, so to speak. Beowulf wants to prove himself worthy of being a king by undertaking a heroic task, and he finds it in the plight of King Hrothgar and his endless battle against a monster and his mother. This section ends happily and triumphantly with the monsters destroyed. Beowulf goes home with everyone knowing he deserves to be a king. By contrast, the second part of the poem is that of an old king nearing the end of his life. Beowulf knows that he will soon meet the fate that comes to all men, but he is at peace because he has done his duty well as a hero and a king. In the modern era, the epic poem Beowulf first appeared in print in 1815. One of its most popular translations, completed in 1926 and published in 2014, was done by the renowned author and linguist J.R.R. Tolkien of the Lord of the Rings fame. Even though it contains many scenes of violence, and Tolkien compared it more to a sad song for a king than to an action story, some scholars consider Beowulf to be a more uplifting work than some of the typical heroic stories from the same time period. This is because, as these scholars have noted, Beowulf does not prove himself by fighting other warriors, other men. His battles are against the evil and monstrous creatures that threaten not only his own kingdom, but those around him. For this reason, the poem is sometimes considered to be a Christian allegory. The story of Beowulf remains popular into the 21st century. The poem is still taught in literature classes, of course, and it has been made into motion pictures several times. The best known is probably the big-budget version released in 2007, which stays fairly close to the original story and could serve as an introduction for a student before reading the actual translated poem.
The protagonist Beowulf, a hero of the Gates, comes to the aid of Hrothgar, king of the Danes, whose great hall hearth is plagued by a monster Grendel. Beowulf kills Grendel with his bare hands and Grendel murders with a giant sword that he found in her lair. Later in his life, Beowulf becomes the king of the Geats and finds his realm terrorized by a dragon, some of whose treasure has been stolen from his hoard in a burial mound. He attacks the dragon with the help of his tents or servants, but they do not succeed. Beowulf decides to follow the dragon to its lair in Fanans, but the only his young Swedish relative Wiglad, whose name means remnant or a Baylor, dares to join him. Beowulf finally slays the dragon, but is mortally wounded in the struggle. He is cremated and burial mound by a sea is created in his honor. Beowulf is considered an epic poem in that the main character is a ham who travels great distance to prove his strength and impossible odds against supernatural demons and beasts. The poem also begins in medias res or simply in the middle of things, which is a characteristic of the epics of antiquity. Although the poem begins with Beowulf's arrival, Grendel's attack had been an ongoing event. An elaborate history of characters and their lineage is spoken of, as well as their interactions with each other, depths, owned and refrained, and deeds of valor. The warriors form a kind of brotherhood linked by loyalty to their lord. What is unique about Beowulf is that the poem actually begins and ends with a funeral. At the beginning of the poem, the king hero Shifson dies, and there is a huge funeral for him. And at the end of the poem, when Beowulf dies, there is also a massive funeral for Beowulf. Now let's proceed to a group activity.
The class will be divided into 4 groups. Then each of the group will make a Venn diagram comparing Beowulf and Grendel. Generalization. What have you learned from the lesson? Make an essay minimum of 300 words about what you have learned from the lesson. Evaluation.
Prepared by Jamaros Broncano from Bised 3A English.